Okay, so today we're going to talk about learning, memory, and cognition. And one kind of key element is really understanding the cognitive perspective of learning, where students are viewed as active participants. And that means they're not just kind of receiving knowledge, but they're acquiring it and co-constructing that knowledge. So they're active participants is the key feature here. So what we know about knowledge is the more you know, the easier it is for you to learn. Some of you you can think about the expression, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Well, the same thing is true with knowledge. The more knowledge you have, the easier it is for you to learn that knowledge. And we'll talk about why that is in just a moment. But let me share with you this really interesting research study by Recht and Leslie. Recht and Leslie wanted to understand how what impacts students' reading comprehension. So they looked at both good readers and poor readers, and also students who knew a lot about baseball and students who didn't. And they then kind of assessed whether or not they were able to comprehend a reading passage that was done, that was on the topic of baseball. And not surprisingly, you can see here that the students who performed the best were those who were good readers who knew a lot about baseball. And the students who performed the worst were the poor readers who did not know much about baseball. But very surprisingly, the other two components of this table were very shocking, because the students who were poor readers but knew about baseball did almost as well as the good readers who knew about baseball. And the good readers who didn't know about baseball did almost as poorly as the poor readers. So what this research study really shows us is that background knowledge is one of the most important elements of whether or not you're going to comprehend what you're reading. Now, if we take a look at the memory process in general, there are three primary stages, and you can use kind of that computer analogy. You're getting it in, that's the encoding, you're trying to store it, that's trying to keep it there, and then finally you need to retrieve it so that when it's time to pull it out, you can find and access that file. Now you can talk about the different layers within that. During the first process, our sensory memory, there's a lot of information coming at us, and we're only keeping information there for like a fraction of a second. Whereas in short-term memory, we're also very minimal in terms of how long. So short-term memory, you can think about it being short in terms of duration, but also in terms of capacity. So it's very limited, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. And long-term memory, on the other hand, is unlimited or forever. So that's kind of like an endless, hard drive space, basically, that we have. So when we talk about memory process, it's important to think about all of these angles. I actually like this slide a little bit better, so I'm going to use this one. We used to think about memory process being very one-directional, like you take the information in, you do something with it, and then if you're lucky, it makes it into the long-term memory. But now we understand it's a much more interactive process. So what that means is that what's in your long-term memory, so this is back to that knowledge and what you know and why it matters, actually influences what kind of information you're going to take in through your senses. It helps you prioritize what's important, and it will also help you when you're trying to learn new content. So basically, when you're taking in new material, you're constantly looking in your long-term memory bank to say, is there anything in here that's going to help me? I'll give you a non-academic example. If you're introduced to somebody new at a party or some kind of social event, if you know that name because maybe it's the name of a family member or a friend, it's going to be easier for you to remember that person's name compared to a name that you're not familiar with. Why? Because you have something to stick it to and connect it to. So our long-term memory really plays a very powerful role in the memory process, and it is very important for teachers to activate our prior knowledge before you're taking in new information, which is why we do the dusting off the cobwebs exercise at the beginning of every class. Now, in terms of short-term memory, I told you it was limited in terms of capacity. Well, it certainly is, and you may be familiar with Miller's famous study where he discovered we only have the capacity to hold on to approximately 7 items at a time. So it's 7 plus or minus 2, so between 5 and 9 items is what our capacity is. In terms of long-term memory, you have a couple of different types. So there's declarative memory and procedural. Procedural has to do much more with the motor skills, like riding a bike, driving a car. That's a different kind of memory process than the declarative process. Declarative memory has several different components. So you have the autobiographical memory, which is more the personal memories of your life. What did you do on your birthday last year? Remembering your loved ones' birthdays and anniversaries and things of that nature. General funded knowledge is more the semantic memory. So, who's the president of the United States? What's the capital of New Jersey? Things of that nature. And then flashbulb memories are very intense memories. So this is when you usually had some kind of emotional situation. So if you think about, 9/11 or very significant events like that, you can almost feel like you're back in that situation as you're recalling the event. And that's called flashbulb memory. Now, in terms of retrieval, there's some ways that we can improve our retrieval. One is to make sure that we encode effectively. So when we encode using multiple channels, we're building in some additional retrieval cues, and that's really very helpful. Context-dependent memories means that we kind of remember things when we're in the same context. And this may come into play. Do you ever go into a room and you forgot what you were looking for, but then when you went back to where you were, you could remember exactly what it was that you were looking for? It's kind of like the environment helps us recall different things. So the most important part of all of this for you as a future educator is how are you going to help your students improve their memory so that they can gain a lot of knowledge, which will help them learn even more in the future. Well, there's a variety of different strategies you can help your students use. We talked last class about multisensory learning, and that's very impactful to make sure you have visual images, give them a chance to try different things. That's going to be helpful. Serial position effect means that we remember things that are at the beginning and end of a list. So when you break class up into shorter chunks, you're eliminating what I like to call the middle mush. The middle mush is like, we're more likely to forget things in the middle than at the front or back end of a learning event. So making it smaller chunks of learning and helping them package their study time that way too can be very helpful. I'm sure you folks are all familiar with mnemonics. Every good boy does very fine. Roy G. Biv, some of these popular ones that really help memory stick quite in a long-term way. Rehearsal is a strategy that students rely on, but is not as effective. So although it's good to review notes, it's not enough. So please help your students recognize that that is not enough. And the problem is it looks more and more familiar, so they will then end up stopping their studying behavior sooner versus later, which doesn't result in increased learning. Now, chunking, on the other hand, is a very powerful learning strategy. This is where you take information and you put it into meaningful units. And when you organize content, this is a very powerful way to learn. So chunking is very, very effective. Elaboration is another great technique, and this is where you're helping students identify examples. So you're saying more. When you think of the word elaborate, you're saying more about whatever it is. Distributed practice means that we're asking students to engage in studying like every day versus just cramming for a test. Because the more you study something over time, the more likely it is you'll recall that content. And then the last one here is the testing effect. There's a lot of research out there that really speaks to testing being a powerful memory tool. So we tend to think about it as a way to show what you know, but the research shows that testing, like doing practice tests and things of that nature, is really one of the best ways that students can build that knowledge base. So you want to build these into your lessons so that your students have good practice at using them. Now let's talk for a minute about forgetting. So the forgetting curve by Ebbinghaus is kind of one of the classics in psychology. And you can see here from this graph that basically what this shows is the research shows that we forget and we forget quickly. So within just slightly over an hour, you have forgotten over half of the content already. Now the good news is we do tend to hold on to about 20% of it. But the bad news is it's very quick that it's going to leave our memory bank. So if you think about classes that you're sitting in, even just an hour-long class, you're going to forget about half of what you learned by the time you walk out the door. And that's kind of disturbing because why are we spending all this time doing that? But of course, there's strategies you could use. You could take notes that will help you, and then you have to engage with the content afterwards. So why do we forget? Well, there's several different reasons. One is we may have not ever got it into our memory correctly, so we may have had some kind of encoding failure. The second reason is that maybe just with time it kind of decayed, it kind of faded a little bit. And the third reason, which is very, very common, is interference. So new information comes in and it interferes with our ability, or it could be previously learned information. So a great example of this is, when we played the name game and we learned everybody's name at the beginning of the semester. Well, between that class and another class, as you meet other students, those other names can, kind of crisscross with the names from the class and make it difficult for you to remember that content. So it's human nature, it happens, but we need to combat against it by using good strategies. All right, I'm going to ask you to remember all these letters. Okay, so how'd you do? Let's see. Now can you remember all these letters? How'd you do? Chances are, if you go back, these are exactly the same, but this didn't probably make any sense to you. So if you're trying to recall these, you're not going to remember them as easily as if I show you these, because these all have some kind of meaning. So basically what this activity shows you is that chunking, or putting information into meaningful units, is going to help you recall more information. Now, if you recall, Miller said we can only hold on to 7 items at a time. Well, this is technically more than 7 letters, but the reason we can remember it is it's really only 4 units because we turned it into 4. Whereas here, these were not meaningful units, so even though they're grouped into 4 categories, they don't have meaning to us. So we would have to, remember them as individual items, and that's too challenging for our working memory. So by organizing content, we increase our capability of taking in that information. And as educators, this is really important because you as the educator are skilled at organizing the content and helping your students take in more information. So that's putting the organization strategy into practice. All right, let's take a peek at the next chapter. So this is still on cognitive processes, but we're going to look at some more complex processes now. So moving beyond memory and kind of up the Bloom's taxonomy into some of the other areas. One important area is helping students practice their metacognitive skills. So metacognition means thinking about thinking, and it involves 3 primary steps: planning, monitoring, and evaluating. So you set some kind of goal, you plan, and then you have to find out, am I on track, am I not on track? You're making some judgments about that, and then hopefully engaging some actions to modify if needed. And we need to help students build this skill set. If you think about Piaget, you would probably recognize the fact that metacognitive skills are not something that we're probably going to be developing with the really young children, but once they get to the formal operational period and they have some more of those cognitive capabilities, they'll be better equipped and ready to engage in these metacognitive skills in a much more deep way. So how do we help students summarize and learn the content? We want to help them look for the big ideas and then identify the smaller details about those ideas. So really kind of helping them sift through this enormous amount of information out there, and we can do that by organizing it into big themes for our lessons. Now, there's some interesting research on highlighting, because when students highlight their textbook, one of the things you might notice is that they often highlight almost everything. Well, the reason for that is because they don't know what is and what isn't important yet. They're not the expert. So you as the teacher are going to help them determine that. And what we know about highlighting is that if it's done well, it can be helpful. And if it's done poorly, it can actually be harmful to learning. So we need to make sure that we're helping students utilize strategies that are going to support their learning and not hinder their learning. So if you want students to engage in highlighting, they should do it in this way. It should be in the 3rd R of the 3R approach. The 3R approach is A, you start off by reading a section of a text. Then B, the second R, is reciting. I like to have students recite that verbally, so at first, and then to also write it down. So the way that I would say it is you would take a section of the textbook, you would read it, you would close the book. I'm going to say that again. Close the book, because then you can't copy. Now as you're taking notes on what you just read, it's coming from up here. So it's a cognitive activity, and you're reciting it out loud and then writing it down. The 3rd R is reviewing. Reviewing entails going back to the text and to see, did I miss anything? And if students are going to highlight, they should wait till that 3rd R to highlight, because now they've engaged with the content a little bit, so they're better able, they're not perfectly able, but better able to differentiate the important from the unimportant. or less important, I should say. The other strategy is encouraging students to only highlight maybe 1 or 2 sentences in each section so that they have to actually think about the content and why this piece is more important than that piece. That cognitive engagement is going to really help them learn the material. You, of course, also want to help them develop good note-taking skills because, as we said before, with the forgetting, the Ebbinghaus curve, it's going to happen very quickly. So if they don't engage in note-taking, they're not going to be successful. So there's a variety of approaches. You're probably familiar with the Cornell Method, where you take notes on the right, 2/3 of the paper, and on the left-hand side, that's called the Q column, you can put in headings and organizational structures, and at the bottom, you can summarize the main points. Now, most students don't use this all the time during class, but it's a great one that you can use after class too. Concept maps is another example of a note-taking strategy that you probably wouldn't be able to do during class, but you certainly could do after class. And that's another skill set that students need to recognize in order to learn. You shouldn't just take notes while you're reading or just take notes while you're in a lecture or in a classroom setting, but then you need to combine and mix and mingle those notes. And the more organizational strategies utilized, the more likely it is you'll remember. In fact, the matrix, which is really just another word for a table, is probably the best, and there's some significant research support that shows that students who put it into table format are more likely to recall it, which is why I'm asking you to write your reading assignments in a visual way and encouraging you to use tools like SmartArt and things of that nature. Okay, so the other big important issue is transferring information. It's not just good enough to know it, but how do we get our students to explicitly see where they could use these skills and put those into practice outside of the school system? So transferring that is also really critical. And one way that we can do that as educators is to explicitly tell them about those connections and give them some examples of how they might utilize that information outside of the classroom setting. Of course, another key skill from a cognitive standpoint in problem solving, you can see here are the steps to problem solving. Students really benefit from watching experts engage in this process. So rather than just telling them how and asking them to do it, model it for them. That can really be very powerful. So whether it's working through a math problem or working through, a more complicated, a case study type problem, talk it through with them. They really will benefit from that. And there are definitely some issues with problem solving. Sometimes, there are, some biases that might come into play. So we want to be mindful of those and help students recognize that these could be blocks to their, creative problem solving. So it's easy to kind of fall victim to some of these that are here. I mean, I'll just take one example. For instance, confirmation bias. We're kind of rooting for something usually when we're in a conversation. We usually have some kind of opinion about it, and we're going to be more likely to, kind of find information that validates our opinion rather than contradicts it. So in order to be a good problem solver, we need to step back and say, oh, wait a minute, maybe that's not quite the way that we want to do things. So I encourage you to think about all the different challenges that are associated with problem solving and how you as an educator can A, be aware of them, B, help your students be aware of them, and then C, set up structures so that students have a chance to kind of self-reflect on what biases might be playing a role in their problem-solving behaviors and what actions they might take as a result of trying to minimize the impact of those biases. Creativity is another area, and I know many of you are interested in and are pursuing, becoming a music teacher, and so the arts and music and all of this is very, very important. I think sometimes in education we're too hyper-focused on rubrics and giving everything exactly the way it's supposed to be, rather than giving students some more creativity and options to kind of, shine and look at the world in different ways. So think about all the assignments and activities that you give. Where might there be some more room for creativity? Does it need to be the way that you're structuring it right now? Are there different kinds of learning tasks that students might be able to engage in? Those are all really important questions to ask yourself. What am I doing to foster creativity in my students? And then the last part that I want to focus on is going to be critical thinking. And, there's divergent and convergent thinking. So Divergent thinking is really about trying to think about many different options, where convergent is more kind of narrowing it down and ultimately choosing one. So, there are different types here, and we're going to talk more specifically now about critical thinking. So, creativity and critical thinking, these are kind of buzzwords out there that are very important for all of us to foster these skills in our students. But let's talk about what that means. You know, unfortunately, sometimes some of the tasks that we give to students actually are not really fostering critical thinking. So this particular research study is kind of an interesting one, because what they did was they had students do every critical thinking exercise that was in a textbook. And then they tested them at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester. And they wanted to know whether or not the critical thinking skills went up. And what you can see here is the critical thinking skills actually went down. So what these critical thinking exercises were more like brain teasers, and they were kind of fun and interesting, but they weren't really in-depth activities that were going to help students develop much more complex critical thinking processes, like being able to evaluate and analyze and things of that nature. They were more like puzzles almost, which weren't bad to engage in, but really didn't transfer to the kind of learning that you would want. Now, however, in this particular case, Blessing and Blessing did a different research project. And what they did is they compared students who engaged in what was called the Psych Mythbuster project versus no project. And what they did discover was that the students who didn't do any project also had lower critical thinking, which is kind of disturbing how it could go down after a semester of school. But the positive note here is that if you give them an intensive semester-long research project, critical thinking actually went up. So the takeaway here is that if you're trying to build these complex critical thinking skills, you can't do it with these isolated kinds of brief activities. You really need to infuse it in the way in which you teach and the lessons that you're giving. So I hope that this was helpful to you, and I will be reconvening when it's time to get back onto Chapter 8. So I'll look forward to the online discussion. Take care.